How incredibly important Prague is in the medieval period. And I think that we learn rather a lot when we look at what the capital of the Holy Roman Empire is doing with concepts of gender at the time. So I am delighted to be here today and thinking I would like to thank everyone for having me here. But in order to think about gender and sex in Prague in the 14th century, first we have to begin to think about it in the medieval period. And for people in the medieval period, we have to understand that everything begins with ancient thinking about gender and sexuality. And this is because it is very explicit within the Christian cosmology that time is linear. We don't often think about this now when we think about Christianity, but it is very much a religion that has a beginning, a middle, and an end. And for Christians, especially in the ancient and medieval world, it is very much thought that we are very close to the end of that. You know, the beginning is when God made the world, as we see here in this beautiful image. And also, we are to understand that the middle is when Jesus came to spread his message. And so we can expect him to return at any moment now. Because the beginning of the Christian world is imagined as the beginning of time when God creates the Garden of Eden, we also need to understand that there's a way of thinking about the world as though it is degrading. And so is our knowledge and our theories, because when humans were in the Garden of Eden with God, our knowledge was perfect. So when we were in communion with God, when we were in paradise, we knew everything that we needed to know. Clearly, we did eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge for a reason as well. But everything that was absolutely necessary for life at the time was there, and we just could know about it, which is fantastic. So as we got kicked out of the Garden of Eden and as we move further and further away, we are degrading in our knowledge. We're degrading in our ideas of the world, and we're degrading because we are further and further away from our time with God. This means that ancient scholars have superior knowledge to scholars at the time in the medieval period. And that means that there is a great deal of reverence for thought from the ancient world, and it is seen as the best possible form of knowledge and the best ways to think about a sexuality and gender, just as it is best to think about them in terms of everything. This can sometimes come to a surprise, as a surprise to people, because they assume that since the Christian world is pagan, then necessarily other people might not want to think about what the world was like before Christ came, in theory, but that's not how people think about it at all. Um, and as a result, we see things like the statement as Bernard of Chartres made, which is that we as humans are standing on the shoulders of giants at this point in time. And what he means like that by that is that in the medieval period, and indeed even now, he would probably make the same argument, we are able to see further because we are able to take learning from the ancient world and put on top of it the ideas that we have now. So we can get back some of the perfect knowledge that we shared in the Garden of Eden by looking at ancient and classical scholars. And as a result, in the medieval world, they are very much attempting to emulate systems of knowledge like the classical world. So, for example, when the university system is founded in the 12th century, so we have the very first university is founded in Bologna, then it's Paris, then it's Oxford. Of course, obviously, we catch up in Prague in the 14th century, thanks to the Emperor Charles IV and the institution of Karlova. But we have this specific way of teaching based on classical knowledge and ideas. And there are two things that you learn. First, you learn the trivium, which is grammar, logic, and rhetoric. And that is essentially getting good at Latin. So you learn Latin, you learn to argue in Latin, and you learn to think as Aristotle did. Very specifically, it's Aristotle. And then on top of that, once you get that, you can move on to get your doctorate, where you will learn the quadrivium, which is music, arithmetic, geometry, and astronomy. So there is a way of thinking that you have to first have your grounding in the arts, and then you can kind of move on to the sciences. But overall, these are called the arts, and this is what you will get your doctorate in. So whenever anyone is educated to an extremely high level in the medieval period, they are using ancient sources in order to get there, which is absolutely critical for understanding the way they think about gender. But crucially, obviously, what they're doing at these universities is they are layering Christian cosmology on the top. So it isn't uncritically thinking about Plato, thinking about Aristotle, thinking about Cicero, which that they absolutely are thinking about all of these people and they revere them. But for them, you take these classical ideas and then you just take some Christianity, you put it on the top, and then you can learn more and know more than Aristotle because technically you're a Christian, so you know just slightly more than that. And we can see the tension between this in works, for example, Dante's Inferno, when he gets to the outer circle of hell and all of the virtuous pagans are there. So he gets to hang out with Plato and Cicero and things like that. So we see that they realize that there's a superiority of Christianity, but they very much look at these people. So I thought we would have a look just at a few of them. We don't have enough time to go into all of them, but for our purposes, some of the most important are Hippocrates of Cos. You may know him as the founder of the Hippocratic School of medicine. There are so many Hippocratic scholars, and we don't actually know that very much about Hippocrates himself, that we kind of just tend to say anything medical that is looking at these things is Hippocratic. And for us, his work is incredibly important because he is, in many ways, the inventor of humoral theory, which will be the basis for all scientific thinking about the body up until essentially the 19th century. I say scientific here, really, we tend to call it natural philosophy now because there's not a lot of science involved, to be honest, but there is a lot of thinking about the body. And so it posits that all matter has four different possible conditions. So you, within the body, have four humors, which are blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These things are then associated with the four elements: air, fire, earth, and water. They are also associated with either being hot and dry, cold and wet. And then everything is sorted into ideas about this. So, for example, spring then is associated with blood, is associated with air, and it is hot and wet. Summer is associated with manhood, which is yellow bile, which is fire, it's dry and hot. Earth is autumn, it's black bile, that's old age. And that is earth, which is dry and cold. And then you get phlegm, which is winter, what they call decrepitude, which is lovely, and it is wet and cold. And as a part of this, one of the ways that we think about aging, for example, in the medieval period, is the idea that when babies are born, they are born as hot and wet as they will ever be. And as they age and age and age, they begin a process of getting drier and colder. And eventually, if you die of old age, what happens is you just got too cold and dry. And that's what old age is. And so within this, we have a very strong idea of male bodies as being the default. So male bodies are what all bodies would be, and they are hot and dry. And they are, for the purposes of medicine at this time, very knowable, very understandable. The ancient world has really strong rules about dissecting bodies because there is the idea of contagion and the idea that if you cut a dead body open, then it's going to let out contagion. It'll let out bad smells, bad humors, and then that will make other people ill. So they have prohibitions about opening bodies up so that you learn more about them. And as a result, that makes women more difficult to treat if you are a physician, because they have all these things inside them that we don't know about, right? So whereas men have external genitalia, women have internal genitalia. And as a result, there's a lot of talking about women's bodies as though they are mysterious or unruly. We will see throughout both the ancient and the medieval world that gynecological texts, for example, are often called the secrets of women because things that are inside women are secretive because you cannot see them, right? And so women's bodies are the opposite of men's bodies. So women are kind of conceived as a mirror image. You know, we see with the humors, everything kind of has to have a mirror. So if men are hot and dry, women are cold and wet. And this will have lots of knock-on effects, but this is the medical thinking around gender at the time. And then we see this then come out in other ways, for example, with Aristotle. And Aristotle is incredibly important for us in the medieval period because Aristotle is so incredibly revered that he is just referred to in the medieval period as the philosopher. Indeed, the great majority of philosophy that happens in medieval Europe is what we call peripatetic, or philosophy that is based on Aristotelian modes of thinking. So, for example, Thomas Aquinas, who is one of the greatest thinkers of the Middle Ages, or indeed of all time, in the 13th century, attempts to argue in the same ways that Aristotle does. And Aristotle writes rather a lot about gender and nature. And what he writes is that men are superior and the female is inferior. The male is the ruler and the female is the subject. He goes on to say, this is from Dan Amalibus. The fact is, the nature of man is the most rounded off and complete, and consequently, in man, the qualities or capacities above referred to are found in their perfection. Hence, women in women it is more compassionate than man, more easily moved to tears, at the same time is more jealous, more querulous, more apt to scold and to strike. She is furthermore more prone to despondency and less hopeful than man, more void of shame or self-respect, more false of speech, more deceptive, and more retentive of memory, which I find very funny. She's also more wakeful, more shrinking, more difficult to rouse to action, and requires a smaller quantity of nutriment. And these are very important because you can see every way that we're talking about women here. It's not as though women have their own qualities. Women have inverse qualities to men. And essentially, what it is that everything that is good about men is something that is bad about women. And indeed, the way that Aristotle often talks about women is he refers to them as either inside out men or sometimes deformed men. So his idea is that when babies are created in the womb, something bad happens. And then all babies would be a man, but then they end up being a woman because something happens in there. And then as a result, you get a woman. These differentiations are said to be natural. And what is absolutely crucial here for the purposes of what we're going to be talking about later as well, is that when he says here that women are more void of shame or self-respect, one of the other things that is happening here is that women are necessarily conceived of as being the more sexual gender. So men are, because they are more logical and better able to think things through, are able to master their bodies and overcome things like sexuality. But women, because they are illogical, are unable to do that, and they are therefore ruled by their emotions and ruled by their libido. And that is absolutely crucial to understandings of gender up until essentially the Enlightenment. And then one more I just wanted to get to very quickly is Galen. And Galen was another very famous thinker, but he's just a little closer in time to us. He actually makes it into the Common Era. And he is a Greek-speaking Roman, which is fun. And he is also a physician. He actually does some dissections, but it's on pigs and bears. Because Romans don't let you dissect things either. So he has looked inside some animals, so that's good. We're getting a little bit better. Um, but he concludes with all of these things, even though we've come about 400 years into the future at this point in time. He says that the female is less perfect than the male for one principal reason, because she is colder. For if among animals the warm one is the more active, a colder animal would be less perfect than a warmer. Why? Because. All right. There's no getting lead. Like we could just all agree, right? A second reason is one that appears in dissecting. All the parts that men have, women have too. The difference between them lying in only one thing, which must be kept in mind throughout the discussion, namely that in women the parts are within the body, whereas in men they are outside in the region called the perineum. So consider first whichever ones you please, turn outward the woman's, turn inward, so to speak, and fold double the man's, and you will find them in the same in both in every respect. Then think first, please, of the man's turned in and extending inward between the rectum and the bladder. And the thing about Galen is he's actually not very wrong on this. We absolutely do know today that there are huge correspondences between genitalia and certainly in terms of the ways that reproductive organs work. But we know now that actually most people start out XX and then something happens. So it's actually they're all wrong. It's the opposite. You know, everyone's a woman who turns into a man, but that's fine. So this is a really important basis of information for us to understand when we begin to talk about the medieval period and indeed the Christian period. So when we get to the patristic era and we have people like the church fathers, such as Ambrose, who's writing in the fourth century, he says that what we need to understand about bodies in general is that the spiritual and physical world are necessarily separated. And so our bodies exist in the physical world in order to get our spirits ready for the proving ground of Christianity. And everything is split in two. There's a spiritual world, there's a physical world, and bodies exist within them. And guess what? They correspond to either the physical and the spiritual world. And you guessed it, men are the spiritual ones, and women are the physical ones, because men are the good ones and women are the bad ones. And the carnality is bad and spirituality is good, so men don't care about their bodies and women do. Uh, Further, now we have the idea of the fall of man, which we referenced before. So Eve eats of the tree of knowledge, and then everybody dies and, and is kicked out of paradise now. And what Ambrose says about that is that if Eve's door had been closed, Adam would not have deceived, and she, under question, would not have responded to the serpent. Death entered through the window, i.e., through the door of Eve. But women were made that way by God, right? So it's not really women's fault that we're bad and and that we talk to snakes and make mistakes like eating from the tree of knowledge because God made us as simply weaker-willed individuals. Um, and as a result, what was supposed to happen there was Adam was supposed to kind of overcome Eve and say, "No, honey, put the apple down. We're not going to do that today." And that kind of messed up there. And but we still have to understand that women therefore need this kind of constant overwatching. And Ambrose goes on to say, she who does not believe is a woman and should be designated by the name of her bodily sex, whereas she who believes progresses to complete manhood. She then does without worldly name, gender or body, youthful seductiveness and garrulousness of old age. So this is very interesting because there is this idea that women necessarily can't attain the same spiritual realms that men can. But if women achieve a certain level of spiritual perfection, then they become like men and then they can go to heaven. And we will see this all the time. For in the medieval period, for example, a monk will die, and then they'll go to bury him, and they'll say, "Oh wow, it's a woman actually," and everyone loves that. They're like, "It's great that Brother John was actually a woman because she overcame her femininity and became a man, and it achieved this perfect perfection." So that's what all women should be aiming at. As a part of this as well, we have to understand that this discussion about Eve is necessarily sexual in nature because now when we talk about the fall of man and we talk about, Adam and Eve were naked and they were ashamed of this, and then God kicks them out of the Garden of Eden. For medieval scholars and patristic writers like this, it's more than that. They realize that they're naked and they're turned on by it. They find it sexy. And so what Eve has done is brought lust into the world. And so lust and sexuality are necessarily linked with femininity. So women are the ones who made sexiness, right? If there was nothing but men, then no one would ever find anything lustful. But as a result of women, they do. And we have to then move on from there. So women are continuously seen as the sexual gender, the one that needs to be controlled in order to have a good ordered society. That. So, if we think about Prague in the 14th century, which we all should, it is this incredibly important city. But one of the things that is crucially different between late medieval cities and our cities now is any great city is necessarily going to have a very thriving and licit sex trade. So, the idea here is that any big city is going to have a number of single men who are working, and they are not going to have an acceptable sexual outlet in the form of a wife. And very interestingly here, this kind of goes against most of our thinking about gender and sexuality because over and over again, we're told throughout the medieval period, women are the sexual gender. They're very highly sexed. They're very interested in having sex. But suddenly, if you're talking about controlling men, then, well, actually, men become sexual. And if they do not have a sexual outlet, because they are hot and dry, the idea is their sexuality and their lust will build up to uncontrollable levels and they will riot. And so, in order to have good municipal structures, every important city has to have at least one brothel in order to see to the men. And because Prague is a huge imperial city, like any other, it has several of these institutions. And we have rather a lot of women who are active in the sex trade at the time. Prague in the 14th century is incredibly expensive. Things like rent, firewood, and food can be very, very difficult to come by. And we know also that it is common practice at the time where sometimes poorer people will be charged more money for the same goods. It's more difficult for them to get things, for example, on credit or buy food in bulk. So everyday lifestyle things are hard to come by. And one of the easiest trades for women to get into at the time is the sex trade, because if you're a little farm girl, and you've run away from your little village, and you don't have any skills other than, typical farm skills, you might not find employment very easy when you get to Prague, but it's easy to get into the sex trade, and there can be a fair amount of money made in the sex trade. Also, conversely, we have to understand that some of the sex workers in Prague aren't there because they wish to be. So, for example, it's fairly common practice for money lenders in Prague. If you lend a woman money, you say you have to work this off. If you take this money, and they'll say okay, and then when they can't pay the debt, they find out the work in question is sex work, which they weren't aware of this. So we have an example about one such woman. Her name was Dorothea of Striegel, and she was in a contract with a woman called Anna Harbatova, and she owed so much money to Anna Harbatova that she was being pimped out and was told that this was under pain of death and she would be killed if she didn't pay this money back. And this is actually a completely acceptable way of doing things, because the reason we know about this at all is that this is in documents where particular women were borrowing money for these transactions, and everyone's saying, oh yes, this is a legal visit. This is a legal business. So, for example, in 1395, we know that one of the town's big madams was lending money to town officials. And so they're like lending money back and forth. If you own a brothel, you can go to the town hall and you can say, I would like some more money, please, for my brothel. And everyone will say, okay, that's fine. So it's a really different way of thinking about the world. And there are rather a lot of brothels, which, okay, now we will look at the map and then we can talk about some of them. So, uh, wonderful. Okay, so we have at this time two what we think are licensed municipal brothels. One is Obora, and it is up near the Rajani. So we know about it because it comes up in certain complaints in the Archdiaconate protocol. So there is a particular priest who complains that he's constantly trying to shut down Obora, and he does this by going in and chasing all the women out and trying to take over the building. And the women just go to the town hall and they say that priest is back, and everyone and they come back and say, "Sir, please get out of the brothel and give it back to the women," right? And so this shows us that this is probably a legal and chartered brothel, and it is behaving in the way that brothels are meant to behave in the Middle Ages. It's legal to have them, but they usually need to be at the edge of town or outside the city walls. So, Obora, it's right up in the near the Rajani. It's kind of outside the walls. You can do with it what you want. The other one that is legal is Hampes, and it is over near the Jewish quarter. And similarly, we know that there's rather a lot going on over there. There will be kind of grumbling about it, but we know that it's allowed to be. You will see on the map too, kind of near the Old Town Wall, Jerusalem, and that had been a brothel, which was Bitnaki, and that is the one that Jan Milic of Grommergij closed down and turned into a religious institution. So it ends up getting closed in this way. I have argued because it became the middle of town when the new town was created, and you can't have a brothel in the middle of the emperor's good new city, can you? No, so you close it. But we also have this one site over here at Krakow Street. And Krakow Street is essentially a center for illegal sex work. So it is a place where a lot of women live, and we think that they are doing sex work, but we mostly think that because of all of the complaints in the Archdiaconate Protocol. So what's the Archdiaconate Protocol? Basically, when we have the new archdeacon come in, he wants to be carrying on his new religious views, and he decides that he's going to go to every single parish in Prague and the surrounds, and he's going to ask the parishioners if they have any problems. And that way, he can get on their good side. He can get to know what the differing parishioners want. And there's all sorts of problems. Czechs who are complaining that their priest only speaks German, Germans who are complaining their priest only speaks Czech. Everyone is complaining that their priest isn't there. The Hussites are going to have a field day with this in about 50 years, don't worry. But a big thing that they talk about a lot is problems with women and sex work. So we hear over and over again that there's sex work that is happening not at Obora, not at Hampais, but in these other places, and people are really unhappy about that. So we basically see here what the limits of what we accept from women are, which is really important, right? So you can have, in theory, you can go to Obora or you can go to Hampais as much as you want, and that is completely acceptable. But there are all kinds of women who are working outside of this, and there are men who are seeing women outside of that, right? So people complain about these brothels, but they can't really do anything about it. But we have in every single other quarter of the town, all of the named churches you see on here, they all make some complaints about sex workers and sex work when the archdeacon comes to see them. So each of these has at least one complaint about sex workers. And, look, so what we can see is that you can invest in brothels if you're a member if you're the mayor, that's something that you're allowed to do. They can exist, but people still don't necessarily like it, right? So basically, what we see is that all of these complaints say that women's activity are suspect, but it's also usually whenever we see people complain about the women, they very, very rarely have any names attached to them. So, for example, when they talk about Krakow Street, they'll say that the street is full of suspect women, so the mulieres suspectus, and nobody knows what's going on over there. Or we will say that they think that there's a beer hall where there are women hanging out, and we don't really know any of these people's names. But we know a lot about the men who are kind of breaking rules. So at St. Andre the Greater, so that's Andrzej Wielki, where's St. Andre the Greater? It's kind of near Jerusalem, if you can see it on the map. There's a man named Tomasz Tele, and he says that there's a gardener named Yakso. And Yakso is living in a common house with women who are what he calls secret prostitutes. So Meretrixes Occultus, which would be a great name for a band. And in theory, Yakso can see sex workers all he wants if he goes to one of the brothels. But the trouble is that he is living in a house where there shouldn't be a brothel, right? This shouldn't be anywhere near this area of town. There's not supposed to be one. So everyone says, oh, that Yakso, he's up to no good and he's in there. But no one says, well, what are the names of the women in there? We never know about that, right? So it's interesting here because the problem isn't that Yakso hangs out with sex workers. If he wants to go to Hampais and do that, that's his business. No one's going to care about it. But he's doing so in an unlicensed brothel next to the church, and nobody likes that. And what we will see over and over again is there are lots of complaints about men who are living with women and running these unlicensed brothels. So same parish, there's rather a lot going on at St. Andre, that we have a soldier, and his name is Vyacheslav Borowski, and he has several secret sex workers in his house every day. And so he's just having huge parties in there, apparently. We also know from the same place that there's someone, Jinjit Kluk. He has secret women in his home. So more than one. As what are they doing in there? Who knows? It's a secret, Then at St. Galen, So St. Gallen is in where is St. Gallen gone? Yeah, there it is. It's just near the Old Town Square. Um, there is a man called Voxov Lopata, and he is also running a unlicensed brothel in which he supports women to whom there is communal access. So you can go to Voxlov's house and access some women, and the locals don't like that. So this is interesting because what we tend to see here is when men are denounced, men of the secular variety are denounced, they're usually doing something more than just seeing sex workers. You have to be running an actual brothel. You have to be disturbing the peace of everyone in order for everyone to complain about it. Okay. What we also tend to see is lots and lots of complaints about the clergy, which it's been argued sometimes that we need to see male clergy as almost their own gender in the medieval period because they're kind of men, but not really because they're married to the church, and that makes you somewhat different, right? So this is where a lot of the complaints come in. So at St. Mary of the Lake, for example, which is kind of near, it's kind of near the bridge, near the Church of St. Francis. Um, they're the parishioners asked the archdeacon to intercede because their priest was allowing suspect women, again, to come and gamble at church services. So they're saying, like, hey, please come to church. You can throw dice and hang out with these suspect women, which is very, very interesting. We also know that at the Church of St. John on the Rocks, which is kind of outside of town, it's kind of like where is it? Yeah, it's Polsgali, so it's kind of in the new town. Where's St. John on the Rocks gone? Yeah, there it is. St. John on the Rocks. This is my favorite priest, Ludwig Goyata. He is basically living with between 4 to 8 public women, and he evades capture when the archdeacon comes to like beat down his door by running naked through the streets. Which the parishioners don't like. They don't like that their priest is running a secret brothel and running around naked. At the Church of St. Giles in the Old Town, the priests are building wooden structures in the churchyard. And in these, they were apparently renting these out essentially as places that you could go to commit sexual intercourse. So if you didn't have a free place to have sex, you could go rent a place from a priest in order to do that in the churchyard. So these are all, big scandals, right? Because that's essentially like making a little makeshift brothel in a courtyard. Okay, so this is incredibly pervasive, right? We see not only are these priests sexually active, but they are creating brothels, and that just shows us how pervasive sex work is at the time, right? And one of my favorite stories as a result of this is when they go up to one of them, and this is at the Church of St. Martin in the Wall. And they say, look, I hear that you're seeing the sex workers. And he says, well, yes, but I only see her occasionally. I always see her at night. And as soon as I pay her, I make her leave. So it's fine. Just, and the thing is, they're being indiscreet enough that all of their parishioners know about this, right? Um, and so this is interesting for us in terms of how we think about sexuality and gender, because if you're just a regular man going to Obora brothel, no one's going to complain about you. If you are a regular man who is running a brothel, they will. And if you are a priest and you're this special third kind of gender, then they're definitely going to complain about you. But at the same time, the priests don't necessarily think it's a big enough deal that they don't think they're going to get in trouble. When the archdeacon comes to talk about them, they say, "What?" They make them leave. You shouldn't be mad at me, right? Um, so we have all of these complaints against men with names, and I can tell you all of their names. I can tell you where they were living. But the complaints that are made against women are much larger, but we only have 5 names for women in the entire thing. There's a woman named Mara, one named Polka, one named Vela, one named Ella, and one named Domka. And they basically all have more than one complaint about them. So in order to get a name in there, more than one person has to be complaining about you. Um, but at the same time, we don't know any of their last names. I can tell you all the last names of all the men who are in trouble, but I can't tell you the names of the women because they're like, I don't know, it's Mara, which is quite funny. And all of these women are specifically in trouble because they say that they're running clandestine brothels. Okay. So Mara is living with a man named Wilhelm of Scala, and they are apparently running a group of secret prostitutes at the Church of Saints Jacob and Philip the Apostles. And they are and everyone is agreeing that you're not supposed to be doing this, right? So there's a man and there's a woman. We know the man's last name. We don't know the woman's first name. Polka, who we know about, moved to the parish around the same time, and this is around the Feast of St. Gall. They know when she showed up. They say this is when Polka came to town, and she runs her own secret brothel, and everybody hates that. Vela and Ella are living in the parish of St. John the Baptist, separate houses, separate complaints, and they are also running secret brothels. Domka is really interesting because she's the wife of one of King Vaclav's chamberlains, but she doesn't live with him. And she's living in a house in the parish of St. Andre the Greater. And she lives with other women, and they apparently sell herbs. And this is a really interesting thing because it's complained about as though a brothel. They're called suspect women, but no one is saying anything that they're doing other than selling herbs. So just being a bunch of women who lives together, everyone thinks this must be a brothel because that's what women do when you put them together in a room. They start selling sex, and these women aren't. They're selling herbs. Incidentally, this is the only woman who kind of gets away with it. Probably she's rich. She's got good connections at the court. They eventually just say leave Domka alone. Um, but it's interesting because we can see here that you don't necessarily even have to be having sex for people to think that you are doing things that are of a sexual nature. So what happens with all of these is then very interesting for our purposes. Because what ends up happening is that we see really different punishments come down to the different people involved, right? So the archdeacon oftentimes gives punishments, or he says, this is what you should do with it, right? So um, if you are one of the men who is just a regular man and you have some complaints against you, they just say, stop it. And that's literally it. Like stop running a brothel. We don't like it. That's not very good. Okay. And that's all, right? Um, when we see priests get in trouble, usually what happens is that they get told, you have to confess your sins and stop doing this, or you will be excommunicated. But that's all that happens. And then they say, okay, I confess, I was very bad, I won't do it again. And they say, well, that is fine, right? So, for example, we have one priest, Wenceslaus of Zap, and he had to promise the archdeacon that he wouldn't play dice or spend time with suspect women anymore. And they said, well, if you do it again, we might put you in jail for a month. But in any case, off he goes. Um, but Václav Borowski, who a lot of people complain about him, they just say, well, what can he do? He shouldn't have the brothel, and that we don't think that he was given any punishment at all. So even like the naked priest that that runs out of the brothel that he's running, we don't have any punishment recorded for him at all whatsoever. Everyone just says, "Oh, well, what can he do? Boys will be boys." In the cases, though, where we have, men who are told either repent, apologize, stop doing this, or nothing happens at all. In contrast, all of the women, other than Domka, who's running the weird herb shop, they basically get excommunicated without having any other choice in the matter. So, for example, Mara, who lives with Wenceslaus of Zap, and they're running this brothel together. Mara is excommunicated, and nothing happens to Boxlov or Wenceslaus. Just like that. That's it. So we know that Mara is immediately excommunicated. So Vilka and Ella, they also get the same thing. They're excommunicated, and they are told that basically the locals are told they can run them out of town. Um, any of the women who are completely unnamed, who are in suspect areas, for example, on Krakow Street, they are all excommunicated, and the parishioners are told that they can run them out and they can just push them out. And this is really interesting, right? Because basically, what the archdeacon will say is that the women can be extirpated. So they could just be completely removed. They can be taken out. They don't get to talk to the archdeacon. When the other priests and things are talking to the archdeacon and he says, "Oh yeah, that's fine. 10 Hail Marys and don't do it again." None of these women get to say anything for themselves or get any kind of way of apologizing, right? So we see that two parish priests at St. Galen are told that they can correct and repel the women who have been hanging out in basically just a bar. It's a beer cellar where there are drinking contests. And again, we don't know that they're necessarily selling sex, but because they're women who are hanging out in a bar, they must be selling sex, and you can get them to leave town, right? And so these are interesting too, because when we see those women who are told, "Oh yes, well you can kick the women out, excommunicate them, get them out of the church," those women are hanging out in bars that we know the names of the men who run them. So it's Voxlav the bailiff and Johannes the passenger. And they don't get in trouble at all. They're running these bars, and there's nothing wrong with them. So why am I bringing all of this up? This is all very interesting, granular detail that I'm sure you love. But what is important is it tells us rather a lot about gender at the time. Because we see who the members of the Prague community are and are not. And men are considered to be members of the Prague community that you talk to when they're doing something wrong. We know their names, we know where they live, and you could say, "Oh, Voxlov, please stop doing that. You're embarrassing us all, and you're going to get us all in trouble." And you can receive a correction, and he'll say, "Okay, well, yes, that was very bad of me. I will stop now." Even if you're a priest and you're doing these things, which makes it much, much worse, you can just get told to stop these things. But the women are not members of their community, down to the fact that they will say, "I know when Polka moved to this neighborhood. She moved here on this particular day. I don't know her last name. I don't want her here." And they can be removed at any point in time. The minute they cause a problem, they can absolutely be taken out of the community. And when they talk about these women, a lot of the time they don't even know their names. They're just women who hang out in this bar, women who live on this street, women who are doing something that we don't particularly like. At which point in time, I would argue what is quite interesting about these women is that they're not members of the community, they are features of the community. So the community would probably include faithful women who never do anything like this, and they keep their heads down and they go to work and they come home and they clean their house and they go to church and that's all they do. That's a member of the community. But the moment a woman steps outside of what the acceptable norms are, she can be excluded, she can be removed, and very forcibly. And we have to understand also that when these people are told you can excommunicate these women and move them on, that's not going to change the circumstances that these women live in. If they are in debt to somebody, a madam who's running a secret brothel, just because you close that brothel and move them on, she's still in debt to that woman. She's still going to have to keep doing this service over and over again, right? This isn't going to give them anywhere to live, which is actually what makes Milich's work at Jerusalem very interesting and important, because when he's getting women out of the sex trade, he says, "You can live here, and I'll pay off your debts and you can live in this house." And they're like, "Okay, great, fantastic," right? So what we see is these really confused gendered expectations, because even though we have centuries upon centuries of philosophical and scientific thinking about gender, which is that, women are the sexual ones, men are actually the ones that are like accessing and demanding access to sex in these circumstances. But men always have a way back. Men are always, because they're more perfect, allowed to be parts of their community, and men are therefore allowed to mess up. Men can do the wrong thing and always be welcomed back, and women cannot. So if you err, especially sexually, as a woman, then you are automatically outside of the community, even though everybody agrees that there has to be women selling sex in order for a community to keep ticking over. So I realize that's rather a lot of information. I hope that made sense. I'd like to have some time for us to have questions. And yeah, thank you so much for listening to me talk about my very favorite thing in the world.